Welcome to the Asia Briefing podcast series. Today, joining us in Hong Kong is Mr. Chris Devonshire-Ellis, the founder of Dezan Shira Associates. Dezan Shira Associates is a specialist foreign direct investment practice providing business advisory, tax advisory and compliance, accounting, auditing, and payroll services to multinationals investing in emerging Asia. On this episode, Chris will be answering some important questions for American businesses to consider when entering the Vietnamese market. Chris, can you give an introduction to the opportunities for American companies in Vietnam?
Yeah, the opportunities really revolve around the changing age demographics in China and Vietnam. So what's been happening is that as the average age of a Chinese worker has increased, 20 years ago it was 23, today it's 37. So these Chinese workers need money. The Chinese government knows this very well, so it's really no surprise that the wages in China have been rising significantly over the last 5-6 years. It's essentially state policy that you'll see wage increases in China of between 15 to 20% per annum for the next few years. So wages are getting expensive, and when you add on top of that about 50% that extra that needs to be paid in terms of mandatory welfare, then the cost of Chinese labour is becoming now expensive. So what this means is that the rising costs of labour in China are starting to make Vietnam a much more attractive destination. And this has significant implications, not least that Vietnam is a member of ASEAN. As a rough rule of thumb, I think that we can see that Vietnamese labour costs are about 30% of those of China, yet it shares a border with China. So with Vietnam being part of ASEAN, China has a free trade agreement with ASEAN, which means that products that fall under that FTA can be manufactured in Vietnam and exported into China duty-free. So it makes sense for American companies to examine the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement and see what products under that agreement fit into American productivity or what American companies manufacture. It also means that for American-owned factories which are already in China, you probably don't want to add additional capacity in China through the hiring of more Chinese workers. It may make better economic sense to put in a subsidiary manufacturing unit in Vietnam and add the labour capacity to that unit in Vietnam and use that manufacturing base again to resell onto the China market or indeed for export manufacturing. The emergence of Vietnam has come in two particular ways. First of all, as a counterbalance to the increased costs in China, so there's been a reaction to that, but also the lower manufacturing costs in Vietnam are springing that as a destination for export-driven manufacturing, both back to the United States or, of course, to other markets throughout Asia and beyond. Again, global manufacturing, those products, it's an economic question. Where can you manufacture that product, both in a sustainable manner in terms of quality, in a way which is compliant with US regulations over health and safety and human rights. And Vietnam is a good answer. They have a good labour system. The country is well regulated. The low age demographic in their workforce. So this is where Vietnam is, and this is where its destiny lies for the next decade.
As you mentioned, there are a number of manufacturers moving from China, especially South China, relocating into Vietnam. Can you expand on some of the trigger points that would cause them to relocate?
So I think the trigger points, wages, definitely there, land use costs, definitely there, infrastructure and the productivity level against China. If the Vietnamese worker can produce at about 70% of the level of a Chinese worker, that's the level where we're seeing that trigger being pulled and relocation to Vietnam becoming a reality. And if not relocation, then certainly the building of additional capacity in Vietnam as opposed to the building of additional manufacturing capacity in China. So those are really the trigger points. So I think that Vietnam will start to become increasingly attractive over the coming 3-4 years.
And how would an American company structure an investment into Vietnam?
Well, there are a number of different ways to do this. Vietnam has a similar legal structure in terms of corporate establishment in the country for foreign investors as China. So one can set up a representative office in Vietnam. Representative offices cannot invoice locally, so you can't trade, but they can serve as useful initial market entry vehicles to assess market opportunities, not just in Vietnam but also throughout ASEAN and indeed in China. Representative offices for that, or for trade facilitation, for looking for suppliers in Vietnam, dealing with shipping companies, quality control issues, these sorts of issues. So representative offices good for trade facilitation, QC or marketing. Over and beyond that, you can set up trading companies as wholly owned enterprises. So they are, as the name suggests, completely wholly owned. The capitalization of those is not particularly significant, and these can be used either for trading, so the importing and resale of products, or for the purchase and export of products, or manufacturing, where both imported components coming into Vietnam from the States or even from China or elsewhere in Asia, added to Vietnamese locally manufactured components, can then be put into a finished unit and then either sold domestically or onto the markets in China. We've talked about that China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, or elsewhere in ASEAN for that matter, or exported elsewhere throughout Asia or the rest of the world, including back to the US. So they're woofers, wholly owned enterprises also in Vietnam. And again, for larger, bigger ticket operations, not so many of them, but in big ticket infrastructure models, then the standard joint ventures are also there. And there are a number of JVs that have taken place between multinational companies in Vietnam, corporations, including state-owned corporations. So the full and expected range of foreign investment vehicles, representative offices to wholly owned enterprises and joint ventures, they're all present and correct in Vietnam, and the regulatory environment tends to support these pretty well, actually. So these, together with available tax incentives, relatively low profits tax base, are making Vietnam increasingly an attractive option from China for American corporations that want to look at export-driven manufacturing, or using Vietnam as a manufacturing base to target the Chinese consumer.
Chris, what is the significance of for American companies with regards to the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement?
Yeah, there's been a lot talked about the TPP, somewhat contentious. It's a proposed trade bloc which includes Vietnam, but also other Asian countries. Australia is in there, Singapore, America, Latin American countries, Peru, Mexico are also part of this. And essentially, some quarters see that as a move to get manufacturing technologies and upgrades into perhaps less developed countries such as Vietnam, to upgrade their production capabilities for them to then be able to sell more product onto the American and other markets. Japan is also a proposed member of this. So the Chinese are not included at the moment in the TPP agreements, and the Chinese view this as a commercial threat. So to give you an example of what the TPP means, in terms of Vietnam's textiles industry, which is actually quite large, only about 10% of the textiles which Vietnam produces are of standards which meet US import standards, quality standards. So it means that Vietnam has been left behind in terms of being able to supply overseas markets with quality textiles. Now, there are a number of reasons why America would want to perhaps lessen dependence on Chinese exports, both political and economic. But in order to be able to develop a counterbalance to China's massive textiles industry, then the TPP, as mooted, would see American and other members, wealthy members of the TPP club, as it were, invest in, say, Vietnamese companies in this particular example, help them upgrade their manufacturing facilities to get their textiles up to standards which are import friendly to markets such as the US, Japan, Australia. So that is basically one of the benefits that Vietnam stands to gain from the TPP agreement. It is controversial. China is really not happy about this. Then at the end of the day, they've also got to compete and the United States, of course, and its consumers have the choice as to where they should buy their products from. So the TPP, with American investment through this into Vietnamese manufacturers, will upgrade the ability for Vietnamese companies to manufacture goods to export quality standards, and in my opinion that's got to be a good thing. The negotiations of this are still ongoing. It is a contentious issue, particularly with China, but we'll have to see how that plans out. But in terms of how it would affect the bilateral trade between the US and Vietnam, if that agreement comes off, and the TPP agreement is definitely something that potential American investments into Vietnam should be aware of. Quite when there's going to be agreement, it may take a couple of years yet, so we'll have to wait and see.
Another partnership that involves Vietnam is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Can you discuss that and how it does relate to Vietnam?
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is made up of ASEAN, the ASEAN nations, of which, of course, Vietnam is a member. So when you talk about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in the ASEAN context, then it includes Vietnam. So the RCEP agreement is a mooted free trade agreement which includes ASEAN, China, India, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. So you've pretty much got most of Asia right there. The agreement will remove tariffs on tens of thousands of products throughout the region, which will mean that you'll be able to manufacture in any of those countries and export them or import them into any of the other countries duty-free. Now this is going to create the world's largest free trade zone. It's currently being negotiated and they're at an advanced stage. In fact, I think the 16th round of negotiations were held recently in Brunei. It's expected that the RCEP agreement will come into effect sometime in 2015. So that represents a significant opportunity for American companies to set up a base in ASEAN and use manufacturing in ASEAN to sell to markets as far away as Australia, New Zealand, you've got all of China in there, India, and of course all the ASEAN nations. We'll be bringing more news on the products which are being negotiated as part of the RCEP agreement on our various news outlets and through Dezan Shira Associates as and when they become available. But it's exciting news, and it'll create the world's largest free trade zone in Asia. So it's going to be a game changer. It will completely change the global supply chain as where goods come from, the costs that have to be paid for them. Trade barriers and tariff barriers are coming down, and the RCEP agreement is very definitely part of that. And Vietnam, being a member of ASEAN, is also part of the RCEP agreement. So something to look forward to.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Asia Briefing podcast series. For additional business resources, or if you would like to learn more about doing business in Vietnam, please visit our website at www.dezshira.com. We look forward to having you join us for the next Asia Briefing podcast.